Hello Stellar people and welcome back to the channel. My name is Trey and today we are finalizing inking season 2 with a recap of the work that I did for the last 3 months, but also we're going to go over what I learned from this whole 3-month experience of practicing inking. But this is season 2, and in season 1 we started with How to Draw the Marble Way by Stan Lee and John Buscema, and we went over some selected works from this, but also other artists to try to figure out how to ink. But to start season 2, we started with Yoshitaka Amano's Coffin, The Art of Vampire Hunter D, to try to give myself some inspiration on what to ink this year. And some of these are the selected works that I really enjoyed making in this year's inking season. So first, let's take a look at my tools. I have some natural brushes, some Copic, and other various brush pens. I have some microns, a lot of microns, Copic pens. I have some jet black Sumi ink and also some watered down inks and various things that I can ink upon. So to start, I broke out my various microns of very varied sizes, and they're easy to clean up, and I just got to work with just making hatch marks, varying line weights, and just practicing to see what I could accomplish with them. And then I broke out my natural brushes and did approximately the same, just making various lines, various line weights, various shapes, whatever I could think of to just practice and get warmed up. This is what I would think of as a warm-up session, where I'm just doing whatever I can think of, just practicing with the tools. How do they feel? Is there any differences between them that I can see and feel? And just making marks. And as for the subject, it would be Lore of the Silverhand, my Conan-ish wandering warrior swordsman type that I've done various ways before, but I haven't got his look quite down the way I want it, and so this was a perfect chance to build on that. And when I have a new character that I haven't really put through its paces, I'd like to make a lot of drawings just to study from, just to figure out what this character is. And I'm pretty much doing that with Lore of the Silverhand. I've made drawings before, but he doesn't have a canon look, a look that I can just go to every single time. And so I've made these various ink sketches just to try to figure out his look. But now that I have a more solid idea, I can now build on that to really lock down what he looks like. And so I'm using these past ones and redoing that for this year to see what I can learn. So to start my pen and ink process, I went with what was the most simple, and that is micron and Copic pens. I was going to do this first illustration or character study all in pens. That's it. And so I was just going to try some hatching, because I've never really gotten very confident with that. But I just broke out the pens and just got to work. I'm not trying to think about what I want it to look like in the final. I'm just here to practice, study, and get better. And I think for this first illustration, the most interesting thing to note for myself was doing the cross-hatching, and then how in black and white illustrations or ink work, it is just the counterplay between darks and lights. You have your white and then you have your bold darks to make the image complete. And then doing that just with a pen has its own set of challenges in that I had to do all of the pants, the cross hatching and hatching, just building up layers to get those values was a bit of a challenge for myself because I'd never really done it before like this. And so that was the most interesting thing about this first character study. Then lastly, for this first character study, because I had done this previously where I threw everything at it, I did ink washes and build up and ink staining and all that, and that's the one on the left compared to the one on the right where it's just pens. And the final result is interesting, but I think I like the one where I threw everything at it, more than just doing with pens. So that was interesting to note. Now with the start of the third character study is where things get interesting. I knew I wanted to bring in natural brushes for this one. And so I wanted to do especially the natural brushes. This is a Sable Series 7 number 3. And I knew I wanted to use it for the hair. I very, very rarely use natural brushes in my art because I am terrified of them and they are quite expensive. This one brush costs about $30 and I always thought I had to build up to using it. So I was using Microns and Copic and Kuretake brush pens just to get some experience under my belt. But after I did the hair, I liked how that looked. And then I went back to my nibs, and here I'm using a G pen nib to define his face. And so I'm now using various things. I'm just using whatever I feel is appropriate. Here I'm using the crow quill to do parts of the image, the more solid parts of the image. And I'm just bouncing around using whatever I think is necessary or appropriate for what I want or the effect I want to achieve. And of course using Microns and Copics, very small pens, for the details of his face and details, again, wherever I feel is appropriate. Also, in the idea of doing something different for this image, I started to reintroduce my love of ink wash. And so I did ink washes for his hair. I think I was going to do 3 layers of ink wash because it gets darker with each layer. It's almost like painting in a way, and I think that's why I like it. So I did 2 layers before I did the staining of the hair, but also eyebrows, shadows, and whatever would be dark, like his pants and his boots. I did that in ink wash, and then I just layered that up to make it look darker, however dark I wished. And then I started on ink staining. Ink staining can be, well, I love doing it, but it can also be very messy. Anything where ink can run into another thing or get smudged or pooled in an area, or I can even drag my hand through it and mess a lot of stuff up. That is the dangers of ink washes and some of this more involved processes. So for example, I put water or pre-wet an area and then introduced darker inks, and it'll bleed and spread, right? And that's what I want. I want it to bleed and spread. And then after that, I would then go in with cross hatching and hatching. So I first did the ink staining, and then I did spot blacks where I take darker inks and then put that over an area for the darker shadows. And I wanted that left leg to go back. I'm adding a little bit of texture that pretty much is imperceptible, but I can feel it. And I also like doing that. But I'm just using whatever I think is appropriate, whatever I want to try out on this image. And then in the end, I use the Microns for hatching and cross hatching, which I'm still new at, but I'm really liking the feel, and especially on the pants because I can get it how I wish. I can deepen the values in certain areas while leaving it just as it is to give an indication of where the light is pretty much hitting. And then of course at the end we do smaller details and cleanup with my white jelly roll pen for the areas that I get a little sloppy, and this Presto whiteout for coverage. And then for the comparison, this is the one I did before a long time ago, and this is the new one. So left is the old, right is the one I just did as a study, and I can tell the difference. I have become a little bit more confident in my inking style. So I think this is a win. And then we'll move on to the next one. And now we are in the unbridled phase. Now I can use whatever I wish, however I wish, to make an image. So this is the last character study for Lore of the Silver Hand. And I know I wanted to use all the tools, the natural brushes, nibs. I have my ink washes, my correcting fluids, and my microns, Copics. And I can use all of that on this image, which is also, I borrowed the pose from Captain America from Drawing the Marvel Way. So the pose is from Captain America, done by John Buscema from Drawing the Marvel Way. And I liked the pose, so I applied that for Lore of the Silver Hand. This nice folded arms, stoically standing with his sword and equipment. First, starting with the natural brush, doing the hair, because I feel it just feels appropriate to me that the natural flowingness of hair would be done with a brush. Still haven't gotten my reps in with brushes, natural brushes, so that's one of the things I'll be doing as the years go on. But I really need to focus on that. But I like the way it looks because it gives this nice undulating feel. With hand pressure, you can go very light lines and very thick lines. Then after that, we go to the crow quill nib, and I start doing the solidness and boldness of the things that I want a little bit thicker in line weight. Then I switch to the G pen for various details. Always start with the face. Trying to get that down is one of the most important things for me. And I think a G pen really does that job well. After that, I bounce around the image and with the G pen and crow quill nib to get all the things that I feel needs to be in place. And then I have this little briefest of background images of his equipment leaning against a rock. And I work on that. And then I use various size pens to do detailing and small detailed work. And I just go over any little bits I can find that adds to the image and both the character and the limited background. And after all the ink work, we then go to the ink wash. And I put a first layer, which is the most important layer. A first layer of ink wash goes over everything that I just want to push. Shadows underneath objects, his pants, his boots, part of the shadow of the rock, anything I can think of. And then we'll just build upon that for the subsequent rounds. Then once I have the values in place, it's time for ink staining. So I can pre-wet an area like the hair and then stain in a darker value of ink and then let that diffuse and spread into the hair. And I also use that ink staining for the pants. So the area that I want a little bit of light or lighter area, I try to leave, or I get it very wet and then I stain in the dark inks into it. And then I can manipulate the values after the fact with hatching and cross hatching. And here's a better example of what I mean by staining. It diffuses into the dark parts. So there's areas where it's not as dark and areas where it is dark. And I can even add even more darks with more darker inks to those darker areas. And then it's time for the long process of detailing. And I detail and correct everything that I feel needs to be worked on, especially in the face area. Eyebrows, eye shade, shadows, eyelashes, anything that needs to be touched up. I do that at this phase. The detailing work, and the most important thing that I wanted to practice this time was hatching and cross hatching. So on parts of his body, the parts of his rib cage, his equipment, and especially the darkness and values of his pants. I really wanted to accentuate that with the values of cross-hatching. And after all that, including the touch-ups with white jelly roll and correction fluid, this is the final image. And I think it came out very well. I was pretty surprised about how I think I've learned something and added more to my tool belt, especially in the staining and cross-hatching department. I'm quite proud of this one. So after the ink studies, the next thing I wanted to do was take the images or the concepts from Yoshitaka Amano's Vampire Hunter D book Coffin and apply that to do some small narrative illustrations in a very quick, about a week turnaround. So I looked at his various art and tried to find some commonalities. How does he ink? All right, so now this is attempt number 2 for Yoshitaka Amano's Vampire Hunter D. And what I like about this one is there's a character, some bold black diagonal lines, and a horizontal line. So as he has his arm out, the character, there's some bold inks to draw one's eye to the character, and then bold inks in the background. And so that was the concept that I wanted to follow. So this time with the concept, I wanted to do on a small index card size just to get the idea out, and then I can refine it from there. So I have my index, and I do this very brief stick figure of what I want. And I want Lore, the character, his arm out in more or less the same pose. He would have his sword in hand, but he would also, there would be like pillars and some kind of creature or the shadow of a creature that would be along the floor. And that was the concept. So for the actual image, the image was executed pretty much the same as I did the character studies, but the main emphasis for this one would be on the background and the creature. Ink washes, ink staining, and a lot of spot blacks and bold inks were the main focus for this image. And the one thing of note is that because Lore isn't the main focus of this image, I don't spend as much time on him, but I've also done other character studies. But mostly it was the creature that was the main focus and that needed the most attention. And in the end, use of whiteout and everything else I've learned, I took this small image and then built it up to this final image. And it has all the elements that I pretty much wanted. The character, the bold diagonal and horizontal lines, and that is what I learned from this study. Now for the finale of inking season, I usually like to do an illustration. So this is the illustration that I did for last year. It was the idea of Lore and the unicorn, the cursed unicorn that cursed him to be Lore of the Silver Hand. And I always like to end it like this, with something that I can call my own that builds upon everything that I've learned. So again, I go from a sketch and do all those steps to get to a final image. And this was a small part of that final image. So for myself, I knew I wanted to do Lore and the Griffin. And the Griffin is a mythological creature that is part eagle, part lion. And so I broke out my index cards and did some small illustrations of what could happen or what the illustration could be. And then once I had 3, I selected the one that I thought was the most deserving or that I liked the best. And it turned out to be this image with the Griffin, Lore, and the Griffin's egg as my favorite. And so I took that image, developed it more on a separate index card, just to try to figure out the composition that I could work from. But the concept figured out, then I went into Clip Studio Paint, and then I just worked out all the necessary small concepts that I would need. The Griffin, the egg, and Lore himself. And what I like about working in computer is that I can put things on separate layers, move things around, shift them around. I'm doing background, so I have a grid, and then I can do effects and change sizes of things, move things around, try different sizes, all of that. That's why I like to work in computer, but usually I then take it into the physical. But anyway your process is, go with whatever makes you feel comfortable. So after I have the briefest of ideas, I develop it a little bit more to try to get it into a place where I can work solidly from. I put some values in just to get an idea of where my lights and darks are. The griffin behind him, I think I wanted it just a little bit larger to be just a bit more threatening. And then I have the basis of what will be the final illustration. And this is basically the steps I use for most of my illustrations. To get to this point, we first start with a thumbnail, usually on a small index card or even smaller. That's why they're called thumbnails. It's just practice to get your idea out of your head and onto paper, no matter how badly it looks. Then I take that initial concept. You can take it into computer or just work physically to build on your ideas. But what I like about computer is that I can then shift things around in any way I wish, increase the size, make things smaller, larger, however I feel, to make a better composition and final image. And so this is what we're going to be working from. And this was the image from the 2025 of the unicorn, of what it was like just before I inked it. So it's not super tight, but everything is there that I can see to then work from. So this is the springboard for the final inks. Not too defined. Since I'm inking it myself, I can take liberties, but this is the final design. Adding all the inks, there were splatters, I did microns, Copics, brush pens, old dry brush pens, whatever I could think of to make this final image. Correction fluid, all of it. And I wanted to do the same for this year's illustration. So once I got to this stage in the drawing, then I knew I wanted to find reference that I could work from. Now, all artists are different, but I think reference is very important in illustration. And I have this book called National Parks, well, America's Spectacular National Parks. I think I bought from Barnes & Noble, and specifically I wanted to look at the Petrified Forest, the Grand Canyon, for those dynamic backgrounds, that's beautiful, and Bryce Canyon, because it has these natural forms that I could just imagine a griffin perched on top of, looking for its prey, before it then dives off of said structure or thing and then dives and gets its prey. So of course, a griffin, to see how it looked in various phases in history, a lion, an eagle, especially eagle's claws. And with that, I could then think about what the exact final image would look like. So we take the image, we knock it back, and now we make a new layer, and then we draw on top of that layer, knowing everything that we've known from gathering the reference, to make a final tighter image that we can then ink from. So I look at bouncing forth between looking at the reference and going back to my image, and then working out everything that I think needs to be worked out to make this final tighter pencil that I can then ink to. And this is my process that I usually do almost every single time I make an illustration or something of, I think that is what I wouldn't call worthy, but something just a bit more polished to it. This is the steps that I go through. Thumbnail to a rough sketch to a sketch, then to a tighter sketch, or a tight pencils, if you will. And this is where I ink from. So then I print that out on 11 by 17 paper. I get my nice Strathmore, and then I transfer that down. And then once that's transferred down, and I use various colors so I know which character is in front of which thing and have everything worked out. And again, I break out my natural brushes, and I use the natural brushes for the hair. After the hair, I go to my nibs and I break down the nibs for all the solid bits of the image. And once that's done, I go back to the face with either G-pins, and then I work out the details, especially like for the fur wrap around its waist. I also use that for the griffin. And I knew the griffin would be a long process because I wanted to do a lot of natural things with the feathers, because I figure feathers are a lot like hair. So once I have the bits that are blocked in, like the claws, and then it was going to be a long process. The longest part of this whole image, I think, was just doing the feathers for the griffin with this natural brush. And so I worked all that out, taking breaks whenever I need to, step away, take a break, come back to it. Never try to feel like you're rushed or stressed when making an illustration. You want to feel just as casual and calm as you can. I do the backgrounds, do detailing, a lot of detailing work on the griffin's egg, and this was just about where I feel pretty confident and solid with it. Then I go to my microns and I do the detailing work of wherever I feel necessary, and microns are of course the best for doing straight lines with, of course, a ruler. And then the dust and effects of the griffin and beating up of its wings, causing or kicking up dust. I was going to spend a lot of time on that. And I just did these small hash marks. And then I would go over that with ink wash after. So this is what it looked like just about when in the middle. And now it's going to be the long process of ink wash. And I wanted a pattern on this very blank griffin's egg. And so I started with that. And I start with the ink wash, doing it as light, and then I just build upon that. So ink wash to ink staining, the ink staining of the griffin, the ink wash is for Laura's hair. And then I would just layer this up over and over again. I usually go about 3. Strathmore or Canson paper is great, but it can only take so much water. And so I try to keep it to about 3 levels of ink wash. And after ink wash, I do the ink staining, especially for Laura's hair and his pants and boots. And ink staining is really fun. Again, ink staining for the pants. And then I would do the cross hatching and hatching to build up some values. The background would be the most experimental, where I did ink washes and then let it bleed to where I want the darkest areas. I also did ink washes and ink stains for the effect of the dust. I also used my fingerprint to build up texture, and I really like how it came out on the waistband of Lore. I don't know why. Well, it's messy and it's dirty, but I love doing texturing with fingerprints. And then back to the griffin. It's detailing time with microns and Copics. Wherever I feel needs just a little bit, make it a little bit punchier. Eyebrows, eyeshadows, underside shadows, hatching, cross hatching, the fur texture of the fur thing around his waist, and anything I could think of. Then correction fluid. I use that for the griffin's eyes. Also, I think after he was cursed, Laura's left eye is like ethereal or slightly menacing. Like it shines, like you would shine a light in the dark and you see a cat's eyes when you shine a flashlight in pitch blackness. That eeriness, I like that. And this was the final image. And here are the steps for this final illustration. And that is inking season. Art is a process, and I love the process. There's a lot to learn. I always enjoy making art. Okay, now let's talk about what did I learn from all of this? What did I learn? So one, I learned different tools are specialized for different situations. And I mean that, like when using natural brushes for things like hair, I really want to get better with using natural brushes. Nibs and like the crow quill and the G pen were great for the body structure. And also, like for detailing, pens and microns are some of the best. Lesson 2 was with ink washes and ink staining to just embrace the chaos. It's gonna get messy, it's gonna get dirty. I kind of like that about the medium, and so I just like doing that, so I'll continue to do that. 3, crossing and cross hatching is really fun to do. I'd never really done it before, but to get values, to deepen values, and you can go from light to dark and all that. Using values with hatching and cross hatching is fantastic. I really want to do more of that, and I will. So those were the 3 takeaways that I came away with this for season 2 of inking season. And that is a wrap on inking season 2. Thank you for joining me. I have been Trey Hodges. You can find my work at treyhodges.com. Power to all the creators. Take care and keep shining, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye.